Errors in reading. There's three things that would happen with your child reading a book and making errors. The child may stop, and especially when the error didn't make sense to them, they might stop, search for strategies to use to figure out the word, wait for your help. They could stop and self-correct on their own, or they may just not stop and continue on with the story. There are three types of errors that a child will make. There's the meaning error, that it's an error that interferes with the meaning of the story, and you want your child to really focus on meaning. So when they don't stop, they may not be focusing on the meaning of the story. They might be using all of their energy, all of their time, just decoding the words and getting through the story. When a child is using meaning, that's often when they stop and either wait for some help, look for strategies, or self-correct. There's a structure error, and these are often not corrected because they still sound like the way we might talk. It might be a different way to say that phrase, and so they're still using meaning. It still makes sense. It's the wrong word, but it's still, the structure of the sentence is still intact. And then there are visual errors, and often these make sense as well. I mean, it could go either way, but often these make sense because if the word is look, they might use a word that's visually the same, and you can either have it doesn't make sense or it did make sense. And if your child stops for these errors, then you know that they're really using meaning to make sure it makes sense. If they're not stopping, then again they're just on decoding words. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read Ben's car, and I'm going to make a few errors along the way, and then we'll quickly go back and talk about them. Ben's red car. Here is my red car. It has wheels with tires. It has doors with handles. Again, with some of these vocabulary words, we've established the pattern clearly, and then the pictures are helping them with those tricky words, and we've got some strategies now to help them with tricky words. It has windows. It has windows with wipers. It has a steering wheel. It has headlights. It has a ladder with a box, with a bag. It has a trailer with a boat. Look at my red car. So you may have made some decisions along the way as your child is reading it, whether to stop and correct some of those errors. We'll discuss that a little more in a minute. But let's go back to the errors that I made. It has windows, I said, with wipers, and that is what I would consider a meaning error. It's still, the meaning was still intact. We have windows with wipers. We don't always call them windshield wipers, but it probably would be important because they omitted a word. It's also important to come back and really point out the fact that they omitted the word, not that it's a bad thing. But again, those types of errors, though it doesn't affect the meaning, it's always good to make sure you go back and say, try that again. Let's make sure we point to each word and have the child, they're going to stop here because that is a tricky word, and you can say, well, you said it has windows with wipers, and clearly skip over that word. That made sense, but there's a word here. What do you think that word could be? And work on those strategies. And again, it's one of those things where you might decide, well, that is a very tricky word, especially for this level. We can let them know that. And they're going to get parts of those words, and chunking, like getting those sounds out in chunks, is also a very important strategy. And windshield, not quite a high frequency word, so letting them know just helps them keep the meaning intact. So I said it has a steering wheel, it has headlights. So that's what I would call a structure error, and it keeps the structure of the sentence intact. It is certainly how we would still say it. We could call them headlights. And again, you want to let them know that we want to come back and just check that. So you can say, you said it has lights, or it has headlights. Well, it could be headlights because that's what they look like. But let's look. Does it begin with like headlights? Well, no, it doesn't. So what could that be? Let's try that sound. And what would make sense there? What else could these be called? Here, I made the error. I said it has a ladder. Well, that kind of really interfered with meaning, because how often, I suppose we could have a ladder on top of a vehicle, but it's probably not, and clearly those are different sounds that they're looking at. So this is also a good one to come back to. They may not be familiar with a roof rack on top of a vehicle, so you might use your judgment, make a judgment call and say, you know, when those are on top of vehicles, those are called roof racks. So it has a roof rack. It might not be worth your time to say what would make sense, especially if they have no experience with roof racks. When I got to this part, it has a it has a ladder, I said, with a box. I said box. That's what I would call a visual error. Box begins with the same letter. It could be a box, but if you remember, I stopped and I came back and I self-corrected. Probably what's going on in my head, and you can ask your child, that was great. You said box, and then you realize that didn't make sense. So what they're probably doing is they realize that it didn't make sense, that you probably wouldn't have a box, or maybe they did notice that the letters were different than box would be. And so whatever the case may be, you can talk it out with them. I'm so glad you went back. It didn't make sense. Maybe it didn't even look right. So I'm glad you went back and you checked that and you changed it. It has a trailer with a boat. There were no errors. And look at my red car.